I thought I had it all figured out. I had a plan, a new life, a fresh start, and everything seemed to be falling into place. But one small mistake, one secret I didn't let go of, changed everything. And in just one day, my entire world fell apart. My name's Brittany, and I'm 24, and let me just say that men are absolutely unreal when it comes to handling anything that doesn't fit their perfect little fantasy. So, I was dating this guy Ethan for about 5 months. He's 29 and works in some warehouse thing, and everything was going amazing until he completely lost his mind over something that had nothing to do with our actual relationship. But let me back up because this whole thing is just so typical of how guys think they can control everything. I met Ethan through some mutual friends at this random house party, and honestly, he seemed different from the usual losers I'd been dating. He had his own place, which was already a step up, seemed to have his finances together, and wasn't trying to play games or waste my time with stupid dating apps nonsense. When we started hanging out more seriously, he was actually generous and thoughtful, always insisting on paying for dates and treating me well. I was impressed because most guys my age are broke or cheap or both, so finding someone who understood how to treat a woman properly was refreshing. The thing is, I'd been doing some online content creation for about 2 years before I met him. Nothing crazy or anything, just some photos and videos to make extra money because regular jobs don't pay enough to actually live on anymore. It was good money, and I was smart about it, building up a solid subscriber base and making more than most of my friends with their boring office jobs. But obviously, when you start getting serious with someone, you have to think about the future and what you actually want your life to look like long term. So after we'd been together for a few months and things were getting more serious, I started dropping hints about wanting a more traditional relationship dynamic. I'd mentioned how nice it would be to have a partner who could provide while I focused on making a real home for us. Ethan seemed really into this idea, talking about how he'd always wanted a wife who would be there for him after work, and how modern relationships felt too complicated and competitive. He'd grown up with parents who had more traditional roles, and he respected that dynamic. I started positioning myself as exactly what he wanted. When I'd stay over at his place, I'd cook dinner and tidy up, make sure he had everything he needed. I'd listen to him talk about work stress and be supportive, never making it about me or complaining about my own day. I could tell he appreciated having someone who actually cared about his comfort and happiness instead of just expecting him to be some entertainment source. The online thing was still happening during all this, but I was already mentally planning my exit strategy. I figured once we moved in together, and I didn't need the extra income, I'd gradually wind it down. It wasn't like I was emotionally invested in those subscribers or anything. It was purely business. I was careful to keep that part of my life completely separate from what Ethan and I had together. When we had the conversation about me potentially moving in with him, I presented the whole traditional wife concept in a way that sounded romantic and appealing. I told him I wanted to be the kind of woman who could take care of our home while he handled the financial responsibilities, that I thought relationships worked better when people had defined roles instead of constantly competing with each other. He seemed genuinely excited about the idea and even started talking about maybe planning a special trip for us to celebrate this new phase. That's when he mentioned Bali, this amazing vacation he wanted to take me on. I was so excited because it felt like confirmation that he was serious about our future together. Here was this guy who was willing to spend real money on creating memories with me, who wanted to invest in our relationship instead of just keeping things casual and convenient. Everything seemed to be falling into place exactly how I'd hoped, and I felt like I'd finally found someone who understood what I could offer and valued it properly. So the night before everything went sideways, we were just having this perfect evening together. We were lying in bed being lazy, trying to decide what to order for dinner, and I was doing my nails because I wanted them to look good for our trip. It was one of those comfortable moments where you're just enjoying being with someone without needing to do anything special. Ethan offered to handle ordering the food so I could focus on my nails, and I handed him my phone without even thinking about it. I noticed him pause for a second while he was using my phone, but I was concentrating on getting my nail polish even, so I didn't pay much attention. He seemed to take longer than usual to place the order, but I figured he was just being indecisive about what we wanted. When the pizza finally arrived, though, something felt different about his energy. He wasn't as talkative during dinner, giving shorter responses when I tried to chat about our trip plans. When I asked if everything was okay, He just said work had been stressful and he was tired. It made sense because he'd been putting in extra hours before taking time off, so I didn't push it. We watched some TV and went to bed early, but I could tell something was bothering him. He seemed distracted and kept checking his phone, which wasn't like him at all during our time together. I woke up in the middle of the night and realized he was awake too, just staring at the ceiling. When I asked what was wrong, he said he couldn't sleep and was thinking about work stuff. I tried to cuddle with him and help him relax, but he seemed tense and distant. I figured the stress of taking time off was getting to him, which happens to people who take their job responsibilities seriously. The next morning was even weirder. Ethan was up before me, which never happened, and he was already dressed and drinking coffee when I came out of the bedroom. Usually our mornings were really sweet and intimate, but he barely looked up from his phone when I said good morning. When I tried to talk about our flight later that day and how excited I was, he just nodded and said we'd figured out. I spent the morning running last-minute errands and getting ready for our trip. I got my nails touched up again, picked up a few new outfits I thought would look good in photos, and made sure I had everything packed perfectly. I kept texting Ethan updates about my day and asking if he needed me to grab anything for him, but his responses were really short and didn't match his usual enthusiasm. By the time I got home that afternoon, I was starting to feel anxious about his mood. He was already there when I arrived, which was unusual since he normally worked later. When I walked in, he was sitting on the couch with this really calm, focused expression that I'd never seen before. It wasn't angry, exactly, but it was intense in a way that made me uncomfortable. He told me we needed to talk before leaving for the airport, and my first thought was that maybe he was planning to propose during our trip and was nervous about it. But something about his tone made me realize this wasn't going to be a romantic conversation. I sat down next to him, still hoping everything was fine, but I could feel that something major was about to happen. Ethan started asking me these really specific questions about my past, like what I'd been doing for work before we got together, and how I'd been supporting myself. At first, I thought he was just curious or maybe trying to understand my background better, so I gave him general answers about having different jobs and figuring things out like everyone else does. But then his questions got more pointed, asking if there was anything important about my past that he should know about. I started getting defensive because it felt like he was interrogating me instead of just having a normal conversation. I told him that my past didn't matter since we were building a future together, and that I didn't understand why he was questioning me like this when we should be getting ready for our romantic vacation. The whole thing felt like he was trying to catch me in some kind of lie, which was insulting since I'd never given him any reason not to trust me. Then he asked specifically about online accounts and whether I had any profiles or activities he didn't know about. That's when I started to panic because I realized he might have figured something out. I tried to stay calm and asked why he was being so suspicious, turning it back on him and asking if he didn't trust me. I pointed out that this was really hurtful timing, right before we were supposed to leave for this special trip he'd planned. Ethan kept pressing though, asking more direct questions about whether I was hiding anything from him. I could tell he already knew something, but I wasn't sure how much. I tried to deflect by getting emotional, telling him that it hurt my feelings that he would doubt me like this. I asked him why he was choosing to have this conversation now, instead of just enjoying our relationship and looking forward to our future together. The whole time he stayed completely calm, which actually made me more nervous than if he'd been yelling or obviously upset. He had this controlled way of speaking that made it clear he'd been thinking about this conversation for a while. When I tried to change the subject back to our trip, he just said we needed to finish talking first. I kept trying to figure out what he might know and how to handle it without making things worse. Part of me thought that even if he'd found out about the online content, I could explain it in a way that made sense. After all, it was just business and had nothing to do with our relationship. I was planning to phase it out anyway, so it wasn't like I was trying to deceive him long term. But I could tell from his questions that this wasn't going to be a simple conversation where I could just explain things away. He seemed like he'd already made up his mind about something, and I was starting to realize that our perfect evening the night before might have been the last normal moment we'd have together. I was getting more scared by the minute, but I still had no idea just how much trouble I was actually in. That's when Ethan pulled out his phone and showed me screenshots of my own messages. I'm not even kidding. He had actual screenshots of conversations from my account, including timestamps that were recent. My heart just dropped because I realized he'd been doing detective work instead of just talking to me like a normal person. He'd gone through my phone the night before when I let him order food, seen the notification, and then spent hours investigating me behind my back. I immediately tried to do damage control, explaining that most of the content was old and that I wasn't really active anymore. I told him I was just keeping the account open to let my remaining subscribers know I was transitioning out of that phase of my life. But then he showed me more evidence, including messages where I'd been responding to people just a few days earlier and even promising new content. I felt completely trapped because there was no way to explain that away. I tried to minimize the whole thing, telling him it was just business and didn't mean anything emotional to me. I explained that I was only responding to messages to be professional about winding things down, that it wasn't like I was actually interested in any of these people. I kept emphasizing that what we had together was completely separate and that this online stuff was just a way to make money while I figured out my next steps. But then Ethan told me the worst part. He'd actually created a fake account to test me, messaging me with a request for custom content, and I'd responded within 15 minutes, offering exactly what he'd asked for. He pointed out that I always took forever to text him back, but jumped immediately when a potential customer contacted me. I felt so stupid for falling into that trap, but how was I supposed to know it was him? I started getting angry at that point because the whole thing felt like entrapment. I asked him how he could deceive me like that, going behind my back and setting up fake accounts to spy on me. I told him that what he'd done was manipulative and showed that he didn't trust me enough to just have an honest conversation. I tried to flip it back on him, asking why he thought it was okay to trick me instead of just asking direct questions. Ethan stayed completely calm through all of this, which made me even more frustrated. I tried to make him feel guilty for not trusting me and for handling the situation in such a sneaky way. I brought up our relationship and the trip, saying that if he really loved me, he would understand that people have complicated pasts and that I was trying to build a future with him. When he asked me directly if I'd been planning to keep doing the online content even after moving in with him and living off his income, I tried to avoid giving a straight answer. I said we could figure out the details together, and that the important thing was that we both wanted the same kind of relationship, but I could tell that my non-answer was actually making things worse. That's when he told me our trip was canceled and that I needed to get my things and leave his house. I literally couldn't believe what I was hearing. Asked him if he was seriously going to throw away our entire relationship over something that had nothing to do with us personally. I told him he was being dramatic and unreasonable, that this was exactly the kind of overreaction that ruins good relationships, but I could see in his face that he'd already decided and nothing I said was going to change his mind. The next few hours were absolutely surreal. I had to pack up all my stuff while Ethan just sat there watching me, not saying anything else. I kept trying to talk to him to make him see how crazy this whole situation was, but he wouldn't engage. When I finished packing, he literally walked me to the door and told me not to contact him again. Then, I heard the locks click behind me, and I was standing on the porch with my bags like some kind of rejected delivery. I tried calling and texting him immediately, but he'd already blocked my number. I couldn't believe someone could just cut off all communication like that after 5 months together. I had to call my mom to come pick me up, and trying to explain why I was suddenly homeless without telling her the whole truth was humiliating. She kept asking what had happened, and I had to make up some story about a misunderstanding that got blown out of proportion. Moving back into my childhood bedroom at 24 felt like the ultimate failure. My mom was asking questions constantly, wanting to know if I was okay and whether Ethan and I were going to work things out. I kept telling her it was temporary and that we just needed some space to figure things out, but honestly, I had no idea what was going to happen next. For the first few days, I kept expecting Ethan to call or text to realize he'd overreacted and want to talk things through like adults. But my phone stayed silent. I started reaching out to our mutual friends, hoping someone could talk sense into him, or at least find out what he was thinking. I tried to present the situation as a misunderstanding, telling them that Ethan had discovered something from my past and freaked out instead of just talking to me about it. Most of our friends seemed confused about the whole thing, which was frustrating because I couldn't explain the details without making myself look bad. I had to keep things vague, just saying that Ethan had found out about some work I used to do and couldn't handle it. Some of them tried to reach out to him for me, but apparently he wasn't talking to anyone about what had happened. The worst part was seeing his social media posts from Bali. He'd actually gone on our trip by himself, posting pictures of all the places we were supposed to visit together. The photos made it clear he was having an amazing time without me, like I'd never been part of the plan at all. Seeing him enjoying our romantic vacations solo made me feel completely disposable, like I'd been so easy to replace that he didn't even need to reschedule. I started telling my friends and family that Ethan had dumped me over something from my past, making him sound controlling and judgmental. I painted myself as the victim of someone who couldn't accept that people have complicated histories. Most people were sympathetic, especially when I cried about how much I missed him and how unfair the whole situation was. But I was also getting angrier every day that passed without hearing from him. Here I was, heartbroken and displaced, while he was living his best life in paradise. It felt like he'd gotten to play judge and jury with my life choices, then moved on without any consequences for himself. I started to think that if he wanted to treat me like I was disposable, maybe I should stop trying to fix things and start focusing on making him understand what he'd lost. That's when I decided to call his mother. I figured if anyone could talk sense into him, it would be family. I called her crying, explaining that I was heartbroken and couldn't understand why Ethan was being so cruel to me. I told her that I'd made some mistakes in my past, but that I loved her son and wanted to make things right. I made it sound like he was punishing me for things that happened before we even met, which wasn't technically a lie. His mom seemed really sympathetic at first. She said she'd always liked me and thought Ethan and I were good together. She promised to talk to him when he got back from his trip and see if she could help us work things out. I felt hopeful for the first time in days, thinking that maybe family pressure would make him realize he was being unreasonable. But that plan completely backfired. A few days later, I got this angry call from his mother telling me to stop contacting their family and to leave Ethan alone. Apparently, he told her the full truth about what he'd discovered, including showing her some of the content I'd been creating. She said she was disgusted and couldn't believe I'd been deceiving her son while pretending to want a traditional relationship. I was furious that Ethan had shared private information about me with his family. It felt like such a violation, taking something personal and embarrassing and spreading it around to people who had no business knowing about it. I tried to explain to his mother that it was just business and that I'd been planning to stop, but she hung up on me before I could finish. That phone call made me realize that Ethan wasn't just ending our relationship. He was actively trying to destroy my reputation and make sure I couldn't get support from anyone who knew both of us. He was being vindictive and cruel, going out of his way to humiliate me when he could have just handled things privately between us. I started getting desperate at that point. All my attempts to reach him through friends and family had failed, and I was stuck living with my parents with no clear path forward. I'd been so focused on transitioning into a traditional relationship that I hadn't maintained my financial independence properly. The online income was still coming in, but it wasn't enough to get my own place right away, especially with the emotional stress making it hard to create new content consistently. My friends were getting tired of hearing about the situation, and I could tell some of them were starting to question my version of events. When mutual friends would mention seeing Ethan around town or hearing updates about his life, it was clear he was doing fine without me. Meanwhile, I was stuck in this limbo where I couldn't move forward but also couldn't let go of what we'd had together. The breaking point came when I saw him with someone new. It was only about 6 weeks after he'd kicked me out, and there he was at the grocery store with this girl who looked completely different from me. She seemed sweet and normal, laughing at something he'd said, and they looked comfortable together like they'd been dating for months. Seeing him replace me so quickly made me realize that everything we'd had together had meant nothing to him. That night, I decided I was done being the bigger person. If Ethan wanted to treat me like garbage and move on like I'd never mattered, then maybe it was time for him to face some consequences for his actions. I called my 2 closest friends and told them I needed their help with something important. I was tired of being the only one suffering while he got to act like the victim in this whole situation. We decided to wait for him outside his house one evening when he got home from work. I wanted to confront him face to face and make him explain why he thought it was okay to treat me so badly. When he pulled into his driveway, We approached his car before he could get inside. I tried to talk to him, demanding that he at least have the decency to explain his side of things, but he just ignored us completely and walked toward his front door. Seeing him dismiss me like I was some random stranger made me absolutely furious. After everything we'd shared together, after all the time I'd invested in our relationship, he couldn't even acknowledge my existence. I started raising my voice, telling him he was a coward for refusing to face me, but he just went inside and closed the door like we weren't even there. That's when my anger took over completely. My friends were just as outraged as I was, saying that no one deserved to be treated with such disrespect. We ended up taking our frustration out on his property, hitting his front door and windows with some rocks we found in his landscaping. It felt good in the moment to finally get some kind of reaction, even if it was just the sound of breaking glass. We figured he deserved to deal with some inconvenience after putting me through months of emotional torture. We left feeling like we'd finally stood up for ourselves and made a statement. I thought that maybe now he'd realize he couldn't just pretend I didn't exist and that his actions had consequences. For a few days, I felt satisfied that we'd gotten some kind of justice for how badly he'd treated me. But then the police called. Apparently, Ethan had security cameras that recorded everything we'd done, including clear footage of all three of us damaging his property. They said I was being charged with vandalism and trespassing, and that I'd need to appear in court. I tried to explain that it was just a relationship dispute and that he'd provoked us by being so cruel, but they said property damage was a criminal matter regardless of the circumstances. I had to hire a lawyer, which used up most of my savings. The legal process dragged on for months, and I had to keep appearing in court while trying to keep my family from finding out the full extent of what had happened. The stress of everything made it almost impossible to maintain my online work consistently, and I started losing subscribers because my content became sporadic and my attitude was obviously affected. The worst part was watching Ethan continue to thrive while I dealt with all these consequences. His new girlfriend seemed to be getting more serious, and from what I could see on social media, his life was going perfectly. Meanwhile, I was stuck dealing with legal fees, a criminal record, and the humiliation of having to explain to potential employers why I had charges pending. The whole situation ruined my reputation in our social circle completely. Most of our mutual friends took his side once they heard about the vandalism, saying that I'd crossed a line and proven that he was right to end things with me. I felt like everyone was against me, judging me for fighting back when I'd been the one who was wronged in the first place. Now I'm stuck living with my indefinitely, struggling to rebuild my finances while dealing with ongoing legal issues. I have to do background checks for any real job, and having an arrest record makes everything more complicated. Meanwhile, Ethan got to play the victim and move on with his life like nothing happened, while I'm still dealing with the fallout from his decision to be vindictive and cruel instead of just breaking up with me like a normal person would have done. Do you think Ethan overreacted? Or was this justice served? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more real-life Reddit stories.